Okay, so welcome to tonight's Dharma talk. We're going to be looking at sovereignty, dignity, belonging, and humility. And I'm going to talk about it through the lens of the koshas, which is a model that yoga uses to express and explore our experience and our potential as humans. But we're going to start with a quiet sitting period. As we sit quietly together, welcome yourself into the quiet that is not just physical stillness, but also the possibility of mental stillness, a reprieve from mental chatter or habit. If your mind doesn't readily respond to the invitation for quiet, you may try resting it on something very tangible, such as the experience of sound in the immediate environment, as well as the big space in which sound itself is occurring. To rest your mind on sound means to deliberately note that sound happens and it dissolves, and not to try to hold on to any one sound, nor express a preference for certain sounds over other sounds. As you rest your attention on sound, also invite your face to relax and for your breathing to soften in your abdomen. Please join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. Thank you, everyone. You may release your hands and open your eyes if you like. So did your mind settle in obediently, quietly? It didn't snuggle up next to you and rest? You're saying no. She said no. Does it ever? Is that the question? One of the challenges we face, of course, is that the mind causes the most distortion and is also one of the functions we have that could lead to the most clarity. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of the brain as an organ and the mind as a function. But I will re-illustrate here on the grease board the model of the koshas so we understand when I say the mind can cause the most distortion, how it causes that distortion. So if you first imagine when a body of water becomes very still and reflective, not still and stagnant, but still and reflective, that reflectivity can reveal both the sky above it, including birds passing, and it can reveal the bottom of the lake, crystal clear so you can see the plant life or the fish. That kind of reflectivity, the water is less disturbed. It might be disturbable by the wind or a splash of a stone if you're skipping stones, or a bird coming down to reach into the water and predatorily pluck something out of the water. But it settles itself back. Most of us don't experience our mind as settling and becoming clear and reflective. And we're often the thing that's muddying it. we're the ones causing the distortions. Even if we're blaming other people for causing the distortions, it's actually coming from within. And I want to explain that a little bit here with an analogy about the same body of water. If you look at when a terrain, if we saw the lake, and we saw that here it's very shallow, and then the water gets very deep, and then it might get shallow again somewhere else. Maybe there's a sandbar, for example. The places where the water is more shallow, the water is more disturbable. A little ripple of the wind will cause more activity there. And the places where the water is deeper, it's less disturbable. Well, the topography under that body of water is actually created, in terms of the mind, is created by us. What I like to call these sedimentary layers upon layers upon layers of thought and conditioning and belief and experience that reinforces our perspective and our beliefs about ourselves. And that layering upon layering builds up under the surface of the water. And then that particular aspect of the water is much more rippleable. You're more triggerable there. Do you understand what I mean? And it seems that we're compelled to spend time in the shallow water, as it were. And those margins in this particular body of water, closer to the shore, we may spend time in because they're familiar. We know the terrain there, and it can seem that out in the deeper water is the unknown, the unfamiliar, and that even equanimity or harmony might seem elusive, and if it were to go on too long, frightening. Has anybody ever had that experience? This harmonious equanimity is going on for quite a long time. You think, what could be going wrong? What is going to go wrong? What's going to happen next? How should I prepare myself for this to come to an end? Generally, as a human organism, we have some trepidation about the deep water, of the unknown. We also have trepidation about what lies in the subconscious or the unconscious. That's why it's often called the shadow, or it's referred to as the darker elements of who we are. But if we don't explore, we won't get to know. And so as we stay in the familiar around the edge of this body of water, for example, we can anticipate and even navigate better our familiar triggers and the familiar ways in which the mind never quiets down, as Jill said. So your ripples might be familiar enough that you don't necessarily see them as they got conditioned into you. You might see them as they are me. This is the way I am. I'm a busy mind, or I'm an agitated sort, or I'm the anxious type, or I'm the fretting type, or I'm the planning type. You might actually see it more as, this is who I am fundamentally, and I have to learn to coexist with it. Which is a good strategy, to coexist with it. More harmoniously, like if you had a roommate who was a little bit of a problem, but you needed the roommate to help shore up the bills and so on, you would learn how to coexist with the roommate. But from the perspective of yoga, we don't actually have to learn to coexist with who we think we are. We're being invited to exist with who we are, as we are. Do you understand the distinction there? And that means, in a way, letting the sandbars that have built up start to change as the topography changes through our practices and our insights and the application of what we learn. When that landscape starts changing and you're a little bit in the deeper, more still, quiet waters, some of the blessings that can overwhelm your heart include a fundamental compassion for the human condition, a sense of gratitude that you even have this precious opportunity to be here on the planet, and immense awe that it all exists, and you were lucky enough to see it existing and to know that it exists in a temporary and fleeting, precious way. But also to swim out into those deeper waters where you may experience those things puts each of us in relationship to our finiteness, our very temporariness here on the planet. And that's scary. It can be very unsettling. Particularly if we're also conditioned to think that the day-to-day tasks are the one that we have to accomplish so that we can keep up with the Joneses or the rat race. These are, of course, American analogies. Do you have the Joneses back in Germany? Do you have a rat race back there? No. These are very American analogies that people get caught up in the 9 to 5 or the tasks that they keep doing and doing and doing, and life gets busy right there. If we have this idea that we have to be super productive, for example, we can miss out on the chance to be in the swell of that awe or that appreciation. It can also distract us just enough from how temporary our lives are. Because there's also a conditioned and yet elusive thing you're going to arrive at, which is like retirement. Used to be called retirement. Now it's called something else because retirement has also changed shape and form. Maybe it's this elusive contentment, or you've got it now. The house is settled. The kids have gone to college. They are stable. The bills are paid. And yet, if we practice enough of the productivity and the keeping up with the Joneses, and we practice enough the familiar topography, it's very hard to then surf into the unfamiliar. So now is the time to start practicing, not later. Now is the time to start being more aware of that process. Not once you get your asana figured out, or you have a better pranayama practice, or you have the ideal job, or the ideal relationship, or the house is clean. Now is the time to practice. That means that the to-do list ought not be so compelling, but the being, the list of how to be and experience that, takes a higher priority. So in terms of all that, yoga is really pointing at this sort of head honcho of realizations, and it gives us roadmaps for how to get there. So I'm going to make a little roadmap up here on the grease board so that you can see an illustration. And pardon me for pulling that forward of your line of sight. So those of you who've seen the illustration before, you get to see it again. I used to say, this is years ago, so this is familiar mental habit for me. I'd say, if you've already seen this illustration, I'm sorry. But I'm not actually sorry. I'm glad you get to see it again. It was just a reflex to say, if I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry. The reflex was to say, I'm sorry. But actually, I think seeing it again can be very valuable to people. So I've learned not to add I'm sorry to the end of a sentence, even though I used to say it reflexively on many other sentences. That was in my topography. So here, at the center of this illustration, is that thing when I say yoga is inviting us not to have a sense of how we've been and we must coexist with it and learn to be more in relationship to this mind chatter. Yoga is asking us to realize who we are. It's represented by the center of this circle, which is called Ananda. And in this model, it's called Anandamaya Kosha. But for tonight, we're just going to call it Ananda because it's easier to pronounce and it's easier to fit it on the board. So this is called Ananda. And Ananda can mean bliss. It can also mean light, like luminosity. It may be translated as love. And I like to translate it in a couple specific ways. One of those I'm going to suggest from earlier today, it's called unconditional belonging. It's like a felt realization that you belong without conditions, that you already automatically belong because you're here, on the planet, I mean. You're already embodied, so there's permission from the universe for you to belong, to exist. There's another way that I translate it as abiding in contentment, or unconditional contentment, ongoing contentment. And I like to use contentment instead of bliss because the concept of bliss usually connotes like a peak experience, and that peak experience can seem like we have to live it now because it's going to be fleeting. But this thing called Ananda is not fleeting. It is the ongoing substratum of human experience. It's the ongoing and indwelling thing, the isness. So it's not fleeting and it's not temporary. It is that which is shining through all things as we can see them with our eyes, including all beings, both prior to our arrival here on the planet and beyond our departure on the planet. So because it's not fleeting and bliss connotes this ecstatic upswell for a short time, I like to call it contentment. Like you really feel like you're resting in that Ananda. You're willing to rest there. So urgency and haste and rumination and daydreaming, they start to fall away when you're at rest here. I think there's an important concept to lay into our conversation when it comes to how we're born hoping for that quality of unconditional belonging. No, we're not hoping cognitively. We're not even hoping intellectually. We don't have the concept in the brain is not there for at birth when you're an infant. You're not born for cognitive intellectual hope. But when beings are born, they aren't born hoping to feel threatened. We're not born hoping that our belonging, our sense of place in the family of things is going to feel threatened. We don't start experiencing that sense of threat until we experience conditioning. And for some of us, that's pretty promptly. And for others, it's intermittent. For some, it takes a while because there's a cohesive family system, so the feeling of threat doesn't arise very often. And for some people, it's chronic, that feeling actually never goes away, that their sense of permission to be here is threatened. Do you understand what I mean by that? I'm saying. Unfortunately, what can happen when you're born into a situation where there's a sense of threat to your belonging is you have to figure out how to mold yourself to prevent the threat from becoming abandonment or annihilation or rejection or all-out alienation, because you wouldn't be able to survive under those circumstances. So we start shaping ourselves to belong. And we start conditioning ourselves based on what we feel and see in the world around us. And that becomes a strong impulse because your imperatives at birth are to biologically survive through attachment, to actually attach to the care providers that you have around you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be fed or held or kept warm or offered the nutrients that you need. So given that quandary, we're born as this thing called Ananda, which is an ongoing, indwelling underswell in the world of love and contentment and belonging, and yet we're born into the family of humans. And upstream and upstream and upstream, humans have practiced forgetting this underswell, this indwelling presence. So we're all exposed to that forgetfulness, and we have our ways of organizing around it. Are you aware of that in yourselves? You've conditioned yourself, and you were also conditioned by life events. So then we have certain conditioned patterns that, again, we think, well, this is just how I am. This is who I am. But it's who you had to become. And it's who you then practiced being. And you practiced it so well, it really feels like you. But there's a deeper sort of you-ness in here, this Ananda. The next layer in the koshas, here, is called Vijnana, V-I-J-N-A-N-A, Vijnana Maya Kosha, and it means the ripple in us, the layer here, that is intuition or wisdom. So if we toss a stone into a body of water, on our clear crystal lake, for example, we toss the stone in, and for a few minutes there are ripples like this. This Ananda is the tossing of the stone. It's considered a causal body. Causal means it causes the ripples to happen. This is considered the first ripple out from there, intuition and wisdom. It's like a shining sense of knowing without book knowledge. It's not based on your IQ, for example. We're not talking about wisdom that you have to earn. It's wisdom that's already indwelling in you. A couple examples here. Some of you have studied many spiritual traditions on our planet, as have I. And here are some underlying commonalities of these traditions. Compassion is recommended. That's universal wisdom here, Vijnana Maya Kosha. Kindness to others is more recommended than cruelty by the spiritual traditions, which usually come out of people's awakened state and then become systems of thought or being. And they all generally agree that compassion and kindness would be wise action here. One of my friends who's now passed on is Bo Lozov. Do you know who I'm talking about? He's the founder of the Prison Ashram Project, and the Human Kindness Foundation. So he spent a year in silence. This was a long time ago, and he was studying the world religions while he was in this year of silence. He wanted to find out, what do they all have in common? And so in addition to compassion and kindness, he discovered these three things. Spend time in quiet every day. That's considered universal intuitive wisdom in these different traditions on the planet. Live simply. Like, don't accumulate a lot of possessions. Don't accumulate a lot of activities. The mind gets clouded by that. And be in service to others. Of the systems that he studied, those were the three commonalities that he could find. So, spend time in quiet every day, live simply, and serve others. And I'll add to this compassion and kindness, and what else would you add to that, which would be like universal wisdom? Universal gestures include stuff like this, the palms together in gratitude, or a nod of the head in acknowledgement. But what are some other qualities that you might put here under universal human wisdom? Yes?
I would say one of the things that all the religions I've seen is taking care of the body. It's a temple or
Taking care of this body as a vessel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What else?
You are loved the way you are, or there's some stable being within yourself that is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good. It's another idea.
Yeah. So we might see in different spiritual practices or religious traditions that there's some indwelling something that is ongoing. Some people might call that a soul. We could call it Ananda, for example. You might call it beingness. In early studies about how children develop, they used to use this phrase, the sense of, what did they call it? Like ongoing being. Oh, no, going on being is how they said it. That the child has a sense of going on being. That's a natural occurrence in the brain of the child, a sense that going on being exists. Mm-hmm. And then we start to have a realization that we're not going to go on being. Mm-hmm. We come to understand reality. But that going on being feeling, we can still have it sometimes in the moments when the time-space continuum drops away and we feel like, I'm really interconnected with all that is.
Mm-hmm. About gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that's relatively universal as well. Gratitude. And I would also add forgiveness. Though people seem to shudder at the concept of forgiveness sometimes. Mm-hmm. I'm not suggesting these things based on a specific circumstance, but that it seems we could consider it wise action to practice gratitude, forgiveness, respect for the body, mind, psyche, love, kindness, compassion. And those don't need book knowledge to understand them. We might need lessons on how to do it because our conditioned mind will get in the way, but we don't need book knowledge to have a sense that those are wise things to do. The next ripple out from there is where the distortions happen. So this is called the Manamaya Kosha. This is where the mind sits. And for a few moments I'm going to talk about the four qualities of this weekend's training: sovereignty, dignity, belonging, and humility. Here at the Manamaya Kosha is where distortion occurs. This is where we hold our conditioned mind. It's where we store our fears and our samskaras and our identifications. It's where we might cling tightly to who we are or to who somebody else is. It's where we might justify our perspectives. It's where we keep repeating behaviors so frequently that we just think, that's the way I am. I'm a person who is annoyable, or I'm a person who never stands up for herself, or I'm a person who's always right. I'm making this up, of course. I'm not describing myself per se, but that I hear these sorts of things from people when I work with them in my counseling practice. Like, that's the sense of who they think they are. And it can be complex. It's not just one station that people have, but that sense that this is me lives here in the Manamaya Kosha. The trouble is that the Manamaya Kosha is like the disturbed water. It has ripples and it's not seeing clearly. So here, in Anandamaya Kosha, as a natural outpouring, a person would have a quality of sovereignty, like just a natural sense that there's a sense of agency. They can operate through the world. They can make healthy choices and find skillful means, and they're not having to do it by diminishing somebody else. They're not having to compromise themselves to do it. There's just a quality of natural expression in that regard. You might think about watching someone like the Dalai Lama as he walks through the world. There's a natural quality in him of sovereignty. In fact, he expresses all four of these qualities so radiantly. There's a sense in his presence that when he walks in, you experience awe just in being with him, but he doesn't experience arrogance in being with you. There's a quality of self-leadership in the Dalai Lama, but I would call it that quality of sovereignty in which he tends to himself, but he knows it's in service to tending to his community. So the distortion of sovereignty can show up in these sorts of ways. When we don't have a clear sense of agency, we can end up thinking that sovereignty is like having power over others, so that we can have some sense of power in ourselves. Or we could misunderstand that sovereignty is like intense self-reliance. In case you haven't heard, self-reliance is a myth. You can't be self-reliant as a human being. You are always other-reliant. This doesn't sit that well in the West, because not only do we have the Joneses and the rat race, we have the Puritan work ethic and the bootstraps. So we're supposed to be able to be self-reliant and get it together. But self-reliance is a myth. Our brains don't work in a self-reliant way. We're always shaped by the brains around us. And just to be here tonight, for example, you're relying on other people. Even the people who established the hardwood floors, or created the building, or who generate electricity for the city of Portland, or who paved the roads with which you got here, or who pumped the gas that goes in your car, or who created the bicycles that you rode to be here. So you can't really be self-reliant, but the distortion at the Manamaya Kosha might say, I'm the self-reliant sort, and I don't have to ask for help, and so on. Or a distortion of sovereignty can also be a person has no sense of agency and they don't take any accountability for themselves or their actions because they may never have learned how to do that. They may have had their accountability taken away at a young age. They don't have a sense of ownership over their own body parts or the result of their actions in the world. And so if you put sovereignty in the middle of that discussion, on either side, there are pitfalls. Do you understand how I'm saying in this regard? So for a person who's lost that sense of accountability or ownership, we want to reintegrate that. And to the person who's gotten overly self-reliant and maybe thinks power over is a better way to experience sovereignty, we have to help with a little softening in that regard. So we're nudging ourselves back to clarity and back through Vijnanamaya Kosha, which tells us, I don't have power over anything really. When the shit hits the fan, as they say, or when the rubber hits the road, do you know these phrases? Okay. As they say, you actually realize I don't have that much power. For example, I said this earlier today. My teacher likes to say this phrase, sleep will attack you. As much as you might try to have sovereignty over not falling asleep, at some point you will want to sleep so badly that sleep will attack you, he says. It will overcome you. And I also said, you can only hold your breath out for so long before your body commands you to inhale. So at the very deepest sense, we don't have power over. Vijnanamaya Kosha will tell you that. You already know it. But in the ubiquitous uncertainties of life and the big swell of the unknown, the human organism wants to have some sort of control/power, so we look for that. My recommendation is sovereignty as leadership with yourself towards skillful action. And sovereignty has a different meaning than control or power over. It's more like a leadership from within. It doesn't have to diminish anybody else, and it doesn't have to amplify you to make sense of you. It's more coming through you. Sovereignty is also the quality that when people have an impulse to do good, even if it goes against a cultural norm, they still have the impulse to do it. If you think back on Thich Nhat Hanh's early life when he was saving the boat people in Vietnam, the impulse to do good, it cost him his ability to live in his own country. He was in exile for a long time. But the impulse to do it was so strong. That's a clear sovereignty. The impulse to put kindness out towards a person who's suffering, even if your family system said people who suffer cause their own suffering, but your impulse to be kind instead, that's clear sovereignty. Do you understand what I mean by that? So we're looking for that sense of clear sovereignty, and be aware that your conditioned mind will get in the way because it likes to distort. It's like the sandbar and the ripples on the water. So the distortions, we just have to be aware of where we fall on the spectrum of those distortions and be helpful to ourselves to come back to sovereignty. So I'm going to put the next ripple up here from the Manomaya Kosha. Usually my circles are a little bit neater, I'm just telling you. You're okay with these circles? Okay. So this is called the Pranamaya Kosha. I think I must usually have the board over here because I'm right-handed. Huh? I do, yeah. So I'll have to get an illustrator on the other side of my board. So the Pranamaya Kosha here represents your vital body. So here you have this thing called the Manomaya Kosha, the mind, and it's constantly affecting the vital body. That is your nervous system, your brain, your circulatory system, your respiratory system, and as a result, digestive, immune, and endocrine systems. What I think is really cool about this, I'm just going to say a little bit back here about the mind, is that you have an autonomic nervous system, I should say the brain, excuse me. You have an autonomic nervous system that wants to keep you going, so it takes care of that. In the triune brain, that's at the brain stem. It wants to see to your vital function so that you exist. Then you also have this part of your brain called the mammalian brain, which wants to help you to bond, to connect, to cozy up like puppies in a pile. But it also has the capacity to cause you to fear other puppies. It's your emotional brain, and it can promptly trigger you into a circumstance where other puppies don't look so friendly. And while that's happening here in the Manomaya Kosha, it sends immediate messages to the Pranamaya Kosha on what to do about it. And the speed with which the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain are working are highly programmed, very speedy, to get you to be preserved and to watch out for threat. Threat to your survival, which sometimes looks like too many puppies in a pile. Like somebody said earlier, and I appreciate that she had said, we could learn to accept intense love and connection without shying away from it. Sometimes the things that we fear are those things that would call us back home to Anandamaya Kosha, because the mind has caused a distortion where that looks more terrifying, and we can start thinking that the other puppies should not be so close, or that our certain pile of puppies is only these couple puppies, not those other puppies. And your Pranamaya Kosha will respond to that by speeding up your heart rate, your breath rate, accelerating your nervous system to send a rush to you to get out of danger, to get out of harm's way. It also has the option of profoundly suppressing your nervous system and really lowering your heart rate and your body temperature and your circulatory response and your respiratory response into what's now called the freeze or submit. So in other dialogues I've talked with you about the polyvagal system, and I'm referring to that right now, that your Pranamaya Kosha from your Manomaya Kosha will register it's time to fight or flight or to freeze or submit. So here's your mind affecting your body through your nervous system, through your respiratory system, through your circulatory system, and that effect feels very, very real, because it is. You suddenly have like a hot flash or a respiratory increase. It feels palpable. You might even start sweating or feeling the anxiety in any manifestation in your body that's your particular map. It will feel very, very real. And your neocortex up front has to think pretty quickly and clearly, but this part of your brain doesn't operate as fast as the other two parts do. So it's kind of outnumbered and outsped, which is why we practice realizing the Manomaya kosha is affecting the Pranamaya kosha. And when you get that rush, you might say, what is happening in my mind? And what can I do about it? And if the mind has certain distortions, we can expect that we'll get triggered more often. So for example, when we experience threat, for some of us, the next life quality is called dignity. When we experience threat, and those of us who go to fight, we might feel like righteous indignation, which is not the same as dignity. Dignity means a kind of internal self-regard that can't be diminished and doesn't have to be amplified or advertised. There's a quiet, assured dignity about who you are, and that you aren't broken or flawed or diminishable. There's always stuff for us to learn as humans. I'm not denying that part, but that this inner dignity here at the Anandamaya kosha is like a gem we can carry around with us. Yet if we go to fight, we might end up in that righteous indignation where we deserve to be angry at the other, or we deserve to interpret their actions as an assault on us, and we deserve to fight back about it, and to claim our stance, and to establish our position, and to make sure they know how right we are. Was that they call it righteous indignation. Have you guys tried that strategy? Have you tried that in close relationships? Frequently it's in the closest relationships that you get to experience those things. Though it's also in the relationships in which you can easily project onto somebody else and thereby trigger your own conditioned mind to say things about the other person. Dignity also gets distorted in the flight response, where we forget the dignity of the other. We're like, forget you, I don't care, I'm walking away, this doesn't matter to me. And we just lost that connection of dignity between the two of us. But you can do it with yourself. When you say to your own self, forget you, it doesn't matter, there's no dignity here anyway, and you kind of escape up and out of your own self. And you treat yourself relatively poorly at that point. So if dignity sits here in the center, and on the one side a distortion is righteous indignation, or a waving off of other people, a disregard or dismissal of them, a dismissal of yourself, what are some of the other distortions you might imagine happen when dignity isn't really dignity?
Patronizing?
Patronizing, yes.
What about embarrassment?
I think embarrassment is a result of something, but we're talking about like the active representation. If dignity is a quality we might feel emanating from us, and it's distorted, we might patronize others, we might dismiss others, we might feel we're more right than they are. We might also get really hardened as a way to protect our dignity, like it's a fragile thing, we're holding on to it with a tight grip. So I'd say embarrassment might trigger the feeling of, I need my dignity now, and this is how I get it. But I wouldn't call it a distortion of dignity itself.
Judgment?
Yeah, prejudice.
What is it? Prejudice. And did you say judgment? Yeah. Yeah. And Jelaine?
You kind of said it, but rigidity.
Rigidity, yes. Yeah.
Well, I guess if you don't regard yourself, then you wouldn't regard others. Probably.
Yes.
So however that would manifest.
Or sometimes people don't regard themselves, and they have a protective mechanism that has to regard others in spite of themselves. But it isn't there's not reciprocity in that. Yes.
I see the fight and the righteous indignation in myself a lot. And over the years, I've mixed feelings about this. Because on the one hand, I have found that in some situations it's really unhelpful. And in other cases, I feel like it's very helpful. especially when it's in collective and group settings and it's the initial fire that gets something going,
Mm-hmm.
because people are expressing their collective anger, and I think that's really necessary.
Mhm.
So I don't know how to parse, and I know you've mentioned before that you don't like the word always, and I appreciate that you say that, because I think that, you know, definitely it's not sustainable to be in fight and righteous indignation all of the time,
Mhm.
but I do think sometimes there's a time and a place for that.
Mhm. So what I like to refer to that as, if fight is a natural biological reaction to threat, and it's going to happen anyway, it can show up as conflict and indignation and judgment and power over, or a feeling of disempowerment, or we can take the best aspects of fight and turn it into advocating. And that, to me, if there's a catalyst that we learn to have advocacy skills for ourselves or for others, it feels like a more skillful use of that quality in us, where we can respect the dignity of the other and our own dignity as well. And sometimes we only get to have dignity by learning to advocate for ourselves. Like, we have to reawaken that inner sense that we matter and that we're worth it, that our self-respect can't be broken by other things outside of ourselves, and that we learn not to break our self-respect down from ourselves either. So is that a helpful way to frame that for you?
Yeah, it is, because I think, you know, I tend to really, I have an aversion whenever the first thing I hear is you have to correct that, or it's corrective, you know, and I appreciate that you say that, because it makes me feel more like you have to find a way to use it skillfully.
Mm-hmm. It's an impetus in us, and we do want to channel it on behalf of the sovereignty, dignity, humility, and belonging of humans everywhere, including ourselves. Excluding ourselves, as you were referring to, that's not so very helpful, but inclusive of us and others.
If you think about Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and, you know, the things that they said and did, I think they were operating from a place of great dignity and also righteous indignation.
Yes.
I think that, you know, in spearheading something that was, they were flicking off what was really wrong, and they were being attacked by it, and ultimately,
Yes.
of course, Martin Luther King was killed for it, but he did have a sense of dignity
He did.
all the way through.
Yes. Yes, he did.
Yeah, thank you, Barb, for saying that also, because I feel like, especially in the States, leaders like Martin Luther King have been de-radicalized, and so we talk about them like, oh, these peaceful, passive, but actually, if you look back at a lot of the speeches, and, you know, there was a lot of anger, and there was a lot of indignation, and nonviolence is sometimes effective because it provokes violence, but just not in the way that we're used to thinking about it. So I appreciate that you said that.
Yeah, and he was really a critical element in empowering what had been disempowered. So the indignation makes sense there. It's when we turn it into righteous indignation, where we have to be right above all else and we forget our humanity. I didn't see that occurring in his life. That, in fact, the impulse in him, the sovereignty in him, was so strong that even at the cost of his own life, he kept going. Similar to other people who've, at the cost of their own lives or their sense of camaraderie, like Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, were both exiled for a long time from their own communities for their impulse to make change in the religious orders of which they were a part. They were judged and exiled and misunderstood. And fortunately, they both survived that long enough to offer their own awakening to people who lived beyond them. That's including us. You follow okay what I'm saying there? Yes?
I was just gonna say, even Yogananda in that movie Awake,
Oh,
I
yeah.
had no idea that he had exiled and then, you know, basically had to leave what he had built in the States
Mm-hmm.
due to distortions.
Yeah.
And then he was able to, you know, continue the gift that he had to bring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When distortion starts to show up, so what happens here in the koshas, we can think of it happening also in the community at large. When the mind is distorted and it starts rattling the nervous system, the next layer out from the pranamaya kosha is the anandamaya kosha. So, the annamaya kosha, the annamaya kosha. So this layer is considered the most dense. It's the body that we see here, touching, feeling, moving, the bones and the muscles. So if you think of it, distortion at the level of the mind ripples into the psychosocial, energetic nervous system of the whole community. This is like when we have cultural distortions and we have intergenerational distortions that keep going. And that distortion, when it goes out of balance in such a way as then a catalyst emerges, like Martin Luther King Jr., the density of the physical body right here represents the density of resistance against that catalyst. It represents the sheer will not to have change happen. And that this is actually considered the only dense body in this model. The Annamaya Kosha is dense. These are all subtle, and this is causal. So in the same regard, your Manomaya Kosha affects your Pranamaya Kosha and becomes the density of your physical body, which means now you have the movement patterns and the muscle reactions and the tension patterns in your body that are generated from your mind to your nervous system, to your muscles and your bones. And so one of the blessings about practicing yoga is that you start changing your muscle and bone body. Here you start moving the tissues of the body. The density becomes more supple. The flexibility, I mean not just the muscles, the flexibility of the whole system starts to improve. And then the nervous system quiets down. We gear in towards the mind, and it becomes more flexible, more adaptable, more willing to have a clear vision, to come back through Vijnanamaya to Anandamaya Kosha. But if we aren't addressing it, the body, the Annamaya Kosha, becomes a dense storehouse of intergenerational events, personal conditioning, and all the uncried tears and unlaughed laughters, and all the unexpressed moments of advocacy that we could have had that we didn't have. And it's living in the tissues of the body here. And then we hope for change. Good to hope, but better to take action. So in this regard, another derivation of the concept of dignity is that a person feels that for them, dignity wouldn't be their birthright. It might be for others, and they may even champion other people's dignity, but not have a sense of their own. Yes?
That was something that came to mind when you were talking about earlier in using the different references, MLKs and the others, is that dignity truly can't exist unless it exists for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't have it just for yourself or the people that you believe are wrong in some way and then stop there. And it's difficult sometimes when you see the wrong behavior of some, but that is what those folks did, was it was dignity for all, even the people who weren't doing the right behavior at the time.
Yes, yes.
And you said, or you're saying about not being able to, like, not being true for yourself. It's funny because when you said about the distortions, I was thinking of, like, how, I mean, it's still hard for me, but it used to be, like, really hard for me to ever take a compliment from someone.
Uh-huh.
And because of, like, my sense of dignity and, like, I didn't have a sense of self-worth particularly. And it was like, if someone said something nice to me, I was like, no, it can't be true, and also, like, you're just saying that to, like, make yourself feel better. It's like some kind of conspiracy theory.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like I can still, like, recognize these nice things about other people and,
Yeah.
like, really feel that they're true. But when someone says it to me, it just can't be.
Yeah. Yeah, so what we might think of in that case is that as a compliment came in, your physical body, your energetic body, and then your mental body were all pre-programmed to reject it. Based on, like, even the synapses in the brain and the muscle fibers knew how you might reject it, and the hand gesture you might use, even if you didn't socially express it that in a big way, the way you might practice the rejection. So if we practice non-rejecting when there's a compliment, you start changing the Annamaya Kosha, the Pranamaya Kosha, and the Manomaya Kosha. So if there's a physical gesture that you have about things like that, and you change your gesture, you can also change your mind.
Is, question about, like, the session that you led today in particular?
Mm-hmm.
Because as we went to, or I should speak for myself, as I went to deeper and deeper sense of relaxation through the ongoing meditation of listening, you said things, like, for instance, changing your, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but it was about operating in the world and having a different way of operating.
Mm-hmm.
So that to get to what she's talking about to a place of accepting that good thing in the process. I mean, this is sort of like a question. I mean, is that a good way to do it? Like to get to a very relaxed state and have it introduced?
Yes, I'm really glad you're asking the question, because there is an element of that where there's the power of suggestion, right? And there's the power of suggestion when you're in an experience where your palate can accept the possible new taste of the suggestion. And if it's suggested in such a way as it's actually attuned to you, you're more likely to be able to take it in. So as a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist, part of my aim is that I can create an environment in which your brains and bodies will find the concept a little more acceptable. And the moment that you might say something, you have to wait and feel if their little antennas are actually available. Are they receiving and transmitting, and do we have contact? And then you might say this sort of lovely and maybe unfamiliar thing, but the mind is listening from a new angle. Yes.
That's pretty radical. I mean, in a good way. No, really, you're changing.
Maybe it's the best possible way of being
Yeah.
subversive.
Yeah. But changing people's minds, changing their
It
lives.
sounds like hypnotherapy.
Yeah.
In a way. I mean, I don't know if anybody, I quit smoking cigarettes through one session of hypnotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was exactly that. I wasn't asleep. She said, on the count of 3, you're not going to be able to open your eyes. And I opened my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we went through a 60-minute session. It was somebody I knew, I trusted, I had a therapeutic relationship. It wasn't like a Groupon, you know. I already had, so I was very receptive to what, I don't know, I feel like that's how people would do hypnotherapy. So, and I mean, it worked.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it sounds, what I'm hearing in this discussion sounds sort of similar.
She hypnotized us.
I did today during class, yeah.
Chicken.
There was a hypnotic state induced by using mindfulness practice in the physical body while using the diaphragmatic breathing at the same time.
Yeah.
So that is to say, you're using the physical body, the Annamaya Kosha. You're aware of the diaphragm at the Pranamaya Kosha. And I'm literally waiting to feel when I might say something to your Manomaya Kosha that brings you back to your Vijnanamaya Kosha and hopefully a glimpse of the Anandamaya Kosha. Now, I'm facilitating that process for you during class, and I'm conscious of it. It's definitely in my awareness that there's something called timing in that case, and there's preparing the field, and there's feeling your readiness for it, and speaking to you where you are as students. So I might make it back to this place with you, not just because I'm like spiritually, verbally entertaining myself. But actually taking you with me.
Would you use it like with a client whose self-esteem and self-worth and dignity is impaired?
Mm-hmm. This is okay. So I'm going to go from this question for the rest of the talk. The part of the talk I wanted to do next, not the rest of it, but the next part. So let's say that sovereignty and dignity got interrupted. That they exist here in the Anandamaya Kosha, but the place of interruption is here in the Manomaya Kosha. So let's call this the samskaric static right here. So if this is static filled enough, the distortions of the mind will prevent a person from really feeling what is their innate sovereignty or dignity. They'll also tend not to have a sense of confidence in their belonging. Belonging emanates from the center of this experience and from the experience of having that shared sense with others simultaneously. When there isn't a strong sense of belonging, the way it gets distorted is things like, I don't belong, I never will belong. The story of, I have to be good enough to belong, or I have to do something more in order to belong, or I've got to work harder, or if I felt it, it's pretty elusive, so I have to keep it. And how am I going to keep belonging? I'm going to organize myself to be someone who's belongable to these particular people who I've now considered my near and dear, which actually narrows down who we can be as humans when you take just a few near and dear who you can belong to or with. And the practice of yoga is to open that up so that there's a sense of belonging to the experience of the human condition, including all the ways in which human condition shows up, so that you wouldn't find somebody else to be so alien if they were experiencing envy or poignancy or terror or judgment, or they seem to be a less likable person or a more likable person. You wouldn't think of them as alien to you. In fact, the Terence, who was a Roman slave way back in the time that there were Roman slaves, and then became a playwright. I know this from listening to Maya Angelou speak a few years ago. He said this thing that she was repeating. He said, "I am human, therefore nothing human can be alien to me." That's the intimate sense of belonging to your human condition. We also belong to the natural world. In case you haven't noticed, you are a part of nature. That's why when you go to different climates, you actually feel different things, like dry skin in Alaska, or re-moisturized when you're in the tropical place. You're a part of the natural world, and you have, as like a plant in the garden, certain better places to be planted and certain less ideal places to be planted. But we aren't just a part of our human family, we belong to the larger family that is the natural world too. So when that sense of belonging has been broken, how are we going to reconnect to that? We're likely to start through the body here with the Annamaya Kosha. Here's one way to suggest that to somebody. When you feel the heart rate and the skin changes and the tingle in the fingers and the thumbs, or you feel the urge for the eyes to blink, or you realize the fingernails are growing themselves, without your consent, by the way. When you realize that's all going on your behalf, it can be like what we call the Zen koan, which means I realize this thing and my mind is suddenly blank from its own conditioning. And I think, how could I not exist as a part of this majesty and belong when right here the evidence is the fingernails are growing without me having to organize them? I didn't give any consent for this to happen, and I actually have to tend to it and take care of it. I'm caring for this thing called the human body. And that's one of the doorways to come back to a sense of belonging at a very pragmatic level, that this is occurring. Also, through the body, we start having experiences in yoga that give us a glimpse that there's more body intelligence going on than we might have otherwise known. Like when your body goes upside down, for example, the circulation changes. You might not have a felt sense of that if you just sit at a desk most of the day and then drive the car home and sit on the couch. If you don't go upside down, you don't get to realize that this body intelligence is really pretty magical. And it does these cool things with you. Taking care of your heart rate, your blood pressure, your intra-abdominal pressure, your nervous system, taking care of the brain so it doesn't get overheated, and the organs so they don't get too cold, and so on. It's all going on in this really magical way. And I like to say, I said this in my book, fortunately you're not having to organize all of that. You would be exhausted. But in yoga practice you start to realize, well, that does happen. These things are occurring. And it's magical and reminds you that there is a larger thing taking care of you. And again, by that simple evidence that you belong. You have a place in the family of things. We also start to see in the physical body when we practice yoga, we start to see our mind distortions showing up, sometimes annoyingly, sometimes rapidly. Here's a few examples. You're on your yoga mat and you have intense sensation and you think, time to leave. Gotta go somewhere else. Time to get out of here. I didn't know what I was signing up for. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. I have to make some emails. Or you're on your yoga mat and the teacher is saying what she said yesterday, because yoga teachers repeat themselves, by the way, in case you haven't figured that out. Yoga teachers are repeating themselves all the time. So are mindfulness teachers. It's repeat, repeat, repeat. And you say, well, I'm really getting bored. I'm so bored. Time to go to sleep. Time for Shavasana. Time for something else. Time to plan my grocery list while I'm on the yoga mat. Time to think about that conversation I'm going to have with so-and-so because now I'm experiencing boredom. Or you're on your yoga mat and the person next to you looks extraordinary in this particular pose and you think, I don't like them. Sometimes they look extraordinary and you also think, they probably don't have like a happy life. Just because they're good at that yoga pose doesn't mean that they're a nice person. So your mind starts playing the habits that it would play, and often you don't know it would play those habits until you're on the mat because they're so well organized in your conditioned life. So then you're on the mat realizing, I have really pretty good mind debris going on, like quite a high content of rubbish happening, yet if you can look at it through the lens of this is what the conditioned mind does, and it's doing this thing called conditioned mind habits, you might become profoundly humble to the experience of human conditioned mind. And that's why humility is the fourth skill in this particular roadmap, that you start to see it and you realize, there it is, doing that thing again. It justifies itself. It proves itself. It makes itself right. It strengthens itself and its habits.
Humility.
Humility.
What was
So,
number 3?
belonging.
Oh.
So when we get to experience through the physical practices of yoga a doorway into the nervous system and the vital body and a doorway into the mind, when you see that mind stuff, instead of just seeing it as terrifying and a sign that you really are a bad person and you've just proved to yourself what a terrible person you are, instead of seeing it all through that lens, you're actually able to see it through the lens of love and belonging, humility and grace. It's arising, it's occurring, and it doesn't actually verify that you suck as a person. However, if we only saw that stuff arising here in the samskaric static, and we didn't have a context in which to experience it, we might think it's actually true. One of the cool things about being in the yoga class is that when the intense sensation of that pose ends, you stop feeling so fidgety. You think, oh, those thoughts were temporary. They came very intensely, but then they seem to have left. Now I'm enjoying this pose. This one isn't so painful, and actually I'm kind of good at it. In fact, I'm better at it than my neighbor is. Oh, there's more conditioned mind coming up. I'm doing it again. And you can start to see it as the characters in your play sort of dancing themselves across the stage, referencing Shakespeare there. They're just waltzing back and forth, making themselves known to you, but they're doing it in this context in which there's a body-centered activity, there's a nervous system nurturing activity, and there's a realization that mind stuff arises, and that to get back home to the Vijnanamaya and Anandamaya kosha, we actually have to travel through that mind stuff with a sense of humility, to reunite with that home ground from which we actually came, and to which we will return. One of the quandaries in the West is that we fixate on changing the Annamaya kosha. We believe the mind is as it is. That's just who I am. But we fixate on changing the physical body. The size, the shape, the proportions, the hair color, the eye color is changeable now. Did you know that? Certain lenses you can put on to change your eye color too. You can change your skin complexion with certain pastes and things called makeup, and you can decorate the physical body here, and you can exercise it, and you can count how many calories in, and you can measure how many calories out, and we are fixated here at the Annamaya kosha. We want our minds to change, but we also have this belief that that's how the mind is. That's who I am. I'm just this sort of person. So we start dismantling that by changing our relationship to the physical body through yoga, and then the energetic nervous system body. And then we can entertain the possibility that my mind isn't so fixed to those things. That isn't who I am. It might have been who I was required to be in order to survive long enough to consider the possibility of expanding my vision of who I am, to include my human condition, not just my unique personal suffering condition. Yes.
So you said, I believe what you said was we want to change the mind. I actually wonder if we believe what our mind says, that we don't want to change our mind, we want to change everybody else and everything outside. I should speak for myself. I would have a tendency to do that. If I just, or if if they would just, then
Yes. I think we want to change the body. We have a sense that the mind is as it is, like that's who I am. Sometimes we want it to be different. I'm not sure we actually want to change it all that much, or we know that we can change it until we start having the realization that it's flexible, that it's malleable. People want their minds to be different sometimes, like less depressive or less anxious, but they might also think, this is just who I am. And if I could change other people's minds, I'd be a lot more comfortable. If I could change their behaviors, I'd be more contented. But it's all woven back to the same construct here at the samskar ecstatic. I believe others have to change so that I can feel better in my own skin. I believe I have to change so I can feel better in my own skin. And what I have to change is the way I talk or walk or dress or the shape of me or some perceived flaw that I have. I have to protect people from that, and so on and so forth. That's the samskar ecstatic that keeps us really stuck. We circle the possibility of Vijnanamaya Kosha and Anandamaya Kosha without actually dropping into it. Other questions at the moment? Yes, Lynn.
Yeah, I was wondering when you were talking about the belonging, the sense of belonging that we
Yeah.
can get from observing our bodies and how they act for us. I was wondering about the times when our bodies are sick and when they don't act for us so well.
But they are. When you have a fever, your body is doing what it needs to fight off something it thinks fever is the response for. When people have the urge to throw up, like you have food poisoning, the body is taking care to expel the toxin. When we have painful circumstances in the body is interpreting that something needs a pain receptor to light up. Whether that something is actually real now in the tissues or mostly in the nerves, that has to be understood by working closely with somebody who can help you. So if it's in the actual tissues that we have the pain, and the pain receptors are telling us there's tissue damage, we have to tend to it. If there isn't tissue damage, but the brain is sending the signal, it's still coming from a perceived responsibility to give us information. Your body's still trying to alert you, still trying to care for you.
Sarah Joy.
The mind will affect the nervous system, and the brain will affect the body. So we have to look back at more in the interior, not in the exterior. Yes?
So I think that's an interesting concept because I don't know what Ellen was talking about, but I know I even used to probably think this, about having a lot of self-loathing for things that were going wrong in my body because my body was supposed to be perfect and then I was perfect. And if that wasn't the case, then there was these things that happened. And weight hasn't been a thing for me, but there's been other things, including this back I deal with, So, and I hear as a society, I do believe in the whole stress, definitely, in what we do in our brain over that. But we also just, it's a human body, and it goes haywire sometimes. Sometimes things happen in there, and it's not anybody's fault, but we have a tendency in that crazy, need a reason for everything, of doing that to people who become sick, maybe not even of their own doing, and then they get isolated with that. I know that you work with a lot of people here like that. I know people right now that need the help you offer and are afraid to come and get it because they have this loathing about what's going on with them, which just is a vicious cycle,
Yes. Well, if you consider that it's not just our personal samskaras that are at this static right here, it's also our cultural samskaras, and that includes historical samskaras, family generation samskaras. Let's go back to what I said about the distortion of sovereignty is I'm going to be self-reliant. Another distortion is self-loathing is motivating, or self-loathing is deserved, or shame is good for motivation. Those are distortions about what we could use as sovereignty. So here, at the layer of the mind where that distortion is happening, I can tell you that when self-loathing is present, if we had real-time ultrasound or real-time MRIs or imaging, we would be able to see the brain firing at the level of there's an actual threat going on in the system. The threat would be self-loathing. It could be a tiger in the jungle, but you also have self-loathing as your internal tiger. And you'd see respiratory changes in that person, and often what I see when there's deeply embedded self-loathing or shame, I will see breathing patterns that are frozen, or chest breathing, or anxious breathing. Like a person has a particular pattern that their body's taken on to tolerate the internal environment of shame or self-hatred. But you do have to then sort of organize around that concept that came from the mind and from conditioned mind, and is now affecting the nervous system and the body. The good news is Anandamaya Kosha is stronger than shame and self-hatred. And I believe everyone can be supported in remembering that. And coming back through the skills of sovereignty, dignity, belonging, and humility is one of the pathways to get back to Anandamaya Kosha. Yes?
I'd be interested to hear more about when you talk about the intergenerational and the koshas and who we are and how much are like what's passed down generations and our like familial generations and from the social justice perspective in our families and our cultures of how that plays into this. Does this make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah. The quandary I'm facing, if you're watching my facial expression, is the quandary about time.
Yeah.
Are you going to be here at the training tomorrow?
No, I won't.
Oh, okay.
We can touch on it another time.
Let me just reflect for a moment. I think it's important that I give a little inroad for sovereignty, dignity, belonging, and humility for each of you to have a sense you can embody that. So I'd like to use the remainder of our time for that, but I'm going to give a really quick and superficial story about intergenerational samskaras. This I've told before, super simple. The woman was cutting the turkey in half to put it in the oven at Thanksgiving. And when asked why, she said, "That's how my grandmother did it." And when asked, "Why did your grandmother do it that way?" she didn't know, but her mother knew that her grandmother's oven was too small for a whole turkey. So the family system was cut the turkey in half and put it in the oven, based on the oven size of the grandmother, not the current oven size.
80 years ago.
Yeah, so, and the daughter didn't know that the grandmother's oven was too small, but the mother knew. The mother just hadn't told the daughter. So what the grandmother did, the mother did, the daughter did. She didn't know why she was doing it, but that's what she was doing. Do you understand?
Yeah.
That's a super simple story, and I'm sorry to simplify it down to something that seems so pragmatic, because there's other ways to talk about what we carry from the DNA of mother through mother through mother, and fathers as well, but the line of mother is very strong because of the intra-utero experience. Yeah. So I have to postpone your question, I'm sorry. So what I'd like to do is have you be physically comfortable. My preference is that you sit upright as if you were a yogi or yogini or a meditator, but hey, those are your hips and knees. You got to lie down, it's fine with me. So I want it to be comfortable where you're going to stay alert.
Are you going to hypnotize us now? Walking like chicken, dancing in the street.
Maybe. You can do what you like with your hands. If that means rest them in your lap or on your knees, that's fine. And you're welcome to close your eyes. Or to quietly look down, if that's easier for you to have a sense of quiet without the eyes closing all the way. So earlier in our discussion, we mentioned that some of the universal qualities of wisdom included compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, kindness. And I'm going to ask you to consider those qualities in your own heart as we sit for these minutes together. And I'm going to introduce a few reflections for you. So, as much as you're able to, consider the reflection through the lens of compassion, kindness, forgiveness, even gratitude. For a few moments, bring to mind the nature of your own samskaric static. That is your own mental conditioning. The place where the water is shallow and the ripples are great. You might think of a time when your frustration tolerance was very low, or your self-esteem was out of balance, or your judging mind was very intense. And as you bring that to mind, consider the possibility of this painful mental samskara as a connection, an understanding that the conditioned mind shows up as pain and suffering for everyone, for humans throughout time. And that to see it in this way, we can practice a moment of humility, even bowing towards the pain that we've been in, to remind us that the human conditioned mind, when it's distorted, causes suffering. You may even visualize yourself joining your hands together and bowing at that human mind state that is yours. And to say again, I see the ways in which the human conditioned mind, when it is distorted, causes suffering to myself and to others. And this doesn't mean that you're bad or flawed. It means the human mind can be painful when it's out of balance, when it's distorted. And as you see yourself quietly bowing to that samskaric static, then relax the corners of your heart, as it were, to rest in your sense of belonging. To rest in this sense of belonging means to welcome all the aspects of who we are, and larger than that, to welcome our place in the family of things. Recognize for a moment that your body is breathing you. Your hair is growing without your consent. Your liver is doing its liver job just now. And that these are pieces of evidence that you belong. In spite of your samskaric static, you do belong, and there's a journey back home. And with this, feel into the possibility of a quiet dignity emerging. A quiet inward sense of undiminishable self-respect. Not the sort of dignity that waits for you to be a certain weight or size or shape. Not the sort that waits for your to-do list to be accomplished. But the quiet, undiminished dignity that emerges from your sense of humility and belonging. And with that inner sense of dignity, which is also a quality of strength, now imagine the sovereignty you may cultivate from your heart towards your mind, towards your brain, and towards your body. It means a quiet kind of sovereignty or leadership to nourish the best in yourself, to lovingly care for the clarity of your mind, the optimal function of your brain, the vitality of your body, and your innate heart's compassion and kindness. And for any moment going forward that you might have a samskaric road bump or a mental tangle, we can use this same process. So let's join the hands together in Anjali Mudra. And towards the samskaric tangle, we can say again, thank you for reminding me that when the human mind in its conditioning is distorted, it causes pain and suffering. I am humbled by that. And through humility, we may re-experience our belonging. We know the heart is beating itself right now. The lungs respirate. The fingernails are growing. And with belonging comes this quiet sense of dignity and positive self-regard. And through that, our sovereignty becomes clear action on behalf of ourselves and others. So may any moment of pain or suffering now be cause to remember humility, belonging, dignity, and sovereignty. And may each of us, our minds, be less distorted as the days go by and our practice deepens. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.